Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, this is your lecture notes for part 2 of imperialism. This one happens to be on Africa. This is the information that you guys had on pages 339 and 344 respectively in your guys' book. This one deals with why the Europeans decided to take over Africa, the second largest continent on the planet. Alright, so first things that you need to know is that industrialization is fueling all of this. And what Europeans are discovering is that Africa has a lot of raw materials. And most of you guys put that down in your guys' notes. Gold, diamonds, silver, raw materials for food or cash crops. Okay, all these are needed for the industrialization process in Europe that's happening at this time period. And by the 19th and 20th century, almost all of Africa becomes a colony of these European powers. And that's extremely important that you understand that, because they're going to use those colonies to help out in World War I. All right. And so the seizure of a country or territory by a stronger country is called imperialism, and that's what's happening during this time period. Is that these European powers are going around the world and taking over weaker countries. All right, so Africa before European domination. Well, as most of you guys put, by the mid-1800s, European powers are dominating this area. Okay, but before that, they really didn't go into the interior of Africa. Rivers were hard to navigate. Most Europeans that went into the interior of Africa died of malaria, which is disease. And then even if they got into those areas, the weapons or technology that they had weren't very much better or different than the Africans had themselves. And so they really didn't stay or go into the interior a lot. They hugged the coast. Europeans hugged the coast, and they pretty much stayed in those areas. So for 400 years, roughly, the Europeans just decided to stay out of the interior of Africa. It's only once the Europeans had the Industrial Revolution and they needed these raw materials that they started to look at Africa as something that they could manipulate and control. But Europeans who did penetrate the interior of Africa in the very beginning were explorers, missionaries, or humanitarians who opposed the slave trade, that the Africans were imposing upon other Africans, and they were sending those slaves over to the colonies in the 1700s. And then travel books and newspapers and magazines kind of glorified Africa as this kind of like wild civilization that needed to be tamed, and you had books like Robinson Crusoe or Tarzan that kind of made it seem very romantic to kind of go into these African places and take them over. All right, so first event that you need to know about is the Congo sparks interest. Okay, a guy by the name of Stanley goes into the Congo area and starts looking around, and he is commissioned by King Leopold II of Belgium. And what they find there is a lot of raw materials, but especially rubber. And rubber trees were used in abundance to facilitate a lot of different inventions, but primarily the automobile. And so Stanley goes in and he signs a lot of treaties with local chiefs, and they basically, without really realizing it too much, give Leopold II control over almost all these territories. But Leopold claimed that the reason for his control was to abolish the slave trade. But in reality, he basically makes the Congo a penal colony where he licensed companies to go in there and harvest sap for rubber trees, and Leopold's private army mutilates all these people if they're not working fast enough. And how he mutilates them is he cuts off one of their hands. And you'll see pictures of it in just a minute. And millions of people die in the Congo because of this. And so the Belgian government took control of the colony from Leopold II as a result. So the king of Belgium kind of used the Congo as kind of his own personal domain. And once all these abuses started getting out, the Belgian government gets involved, and then eventually the French are alarmed by what the Belgians are doing, and then they start getting involved and they start poking around. And then you got the British and other European nations kind of going in and going, oh, there's a lot of raw materials here. There's a lot of markets here. There's a lot of people that we can use to gain all this raw materials for our own resources. So here you have pictures of people that were abused by Leopold II's private army, and they lost their hands because they weren't working fast enough, supplying the Belgians with rubber. Okay, so again, other forces that are driving imperialism in Africa. Already mentioned the Industrial Revolution. Okay, there's a belief that Europeans are superior to all other races. There's a lot of national pride going on here, or nationalism. Definitely racism. The superiority of one race over another was expressed in this idea of social Darwinism, that Europeans are socially better than everybody else, and so therefore, there's proof of that because that they are civilized, while all these other places around the world are uncivilized, and so we need to go in there and show them, these other places, that they can be civilized just like the Europeans are. And either these nations, these places around the world can get on the bandwagon or not. And if they don't get on the bandwagon, then they're just going to peter out and socially die. And so the Europeans thought that because they had the Industrial Revolution, that they were smarter than these people, and they wanted to dominate them because of that reason, or felt they need to. Okay. Factors promoting imperialism in Africa. European technological superiority. You have the Maxim gun, which I noticed a lot of you guys put into your guys' paper the other day. First automatic machine gun. You're going to see a picture of it in a minute. They have the means to control an empire through steam engines, railroads, cable lines, steamships, medical advancements, especially a drug called quinine, which is an anti-malaria drug that's developed in 1829. So with this drug, Europeans no longer have to worry about malaria or going into the interior and dying because of it. That doesn't necessarily mean that they still weren't dying because of it, but the chances of dying it were greatly reduced because of this drug called quinine. And then, of course, the Africans themselves were rivals. There's hundreds of ethnic and groups throughout Africa during this time period, and what the Europeans would do is they'd say, okay, we're going to give Group A over here lots of help, and we want you to go fight Group B over here, and then another European group would give weapons and technology to Group B, and so they just kind of picked all these European nations or groups off from one another. And in the meantime, the Europeans are getting rich and taking advantage of the situation, and the ones that are really suffering are the Africans. Okay, here's a picture of the machine gun right here that the Europeans had. Okay, so once diamonds and gold is discovered in Africa, okay, the Europeans take more of an interest, if they didn't already take an interest, and they have what's called the Berlin Conference. And at the Berlin Conference, 14 European nations show up, and no Africans were invited to this conference. It was all European nations, and they essentially had a map of Africa in front of them, and they basically said, whatever European nation can get to these areas first and control it, they will be the ones that are controlling that part of Africa. And so at that point, they left the conference and they literally all started planning to divide up Africa. And that's why it's called the scramble for Africa, is because they're all scrambling around, putting as much men and military resources into these areas to control them. So they're also planting a lot of cash crops, such as peanuts, palm oil, cocoa, rubber, and finding a lot of gold, tin, copper, and diamonds also in these areas as well. Three groups that you should be knowing about that are clashing in South Africa are the Zulus. The Zulus, under the leadership of Shaka, actually do fight back against the British. For a while, they're fairly successful of fighting back the British because primarily Shaka uses a highly disciplined warrior group and is a good military organization leader, and he forms this large Zulu state, which the British do fear for a while until the British are able to use their technological advancements to subdue these Zulus. Okay. The other thing that you should be aware of is that you've got the British and the Dutch fighting over South Africa. Again, primarily because that's where a large portion of the diamonds are from. Okay, you have these Dutch settlers that were there called the Boers. Later they were called Afrikaners. And so you've got the British trying to control South Africa. You've got the British and the Boers fighting. You've got the Boers and the Zulus fighting. You've got the Zulus fighting against the British. And so you've got all these different groups of people fighting in South Africa. And they're primarily known as the Boer Wars. Okay, and here's where the Boer Wars are located, the very bottom part of South Africa. All right, so you've got the first stage of the Boer War, you got the second stage of the Boer War, but the bottom line is like it says right here, okay, by 1910 the British went out and they formed the Union of South Africa. All right, that's all you guys' notes for Africa. If you have any questions, please ask them in class when you can. Thanks for watching.